Do you have to go to Bible college or seminary? I did that on purpose. To preach the gospel, to minister for Christ? Good question. A lot of people think, I can't do it. I can't teach the Bible. I can't lead someone to the Lord. I haven't been to college, Bible college or seminary. How am I going to do that? I love this passage of scripture, Acts 8, verses 1 through 4. Now, what had happened, I set the context up for you. Stephen had just been killed, been stoned to death. And a man named Saul of Tarsus, who became the great apostle Paul, was persecuting the church. And people fled Jerusalem because of that persecution. Look at the 8th chapter of Acts, starting at verse 1. We'll read through verse 4. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church at Jerusalem. Listen to this. All except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. The apostles were the guys who Jesus trained them for 3 years, okay? They didn't leave, they stayed. They stayed in Jerusalem. They were the trained dudes. They stayed in Jerusalem. Verse 2, godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off men and women and put them in prison. Those who had been scattered, and remember who had been scattered, everybody except the trained guys had been scattered. Just the folks. They hadn't been trained by Jesus. No Bible colleges, no seminaries, okay? Verse 4, then those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. That's how they reached the world for Christ. I'm a Bible college graduate, okay? But let me tell you, I have known some folks who were not and spent their life making a difference for Christ. I was thinking about my grandpa. My grandpa taught a Bible class in a church in Phoenix, Arizona in the 1920s. And some women who were part of a missionary society said, we got this new church going on in the city of Chandler, which wasn't really a city. It was a little kind of dusty desert town in those days in the late 20s. And maybe a couple thousand people out there. We started a church, they said, in Chandler. We want you to go out there and be the preacher. You know what he did? He went. And he spent the rest of his life preaching. A lot of his ministries were bivocational, we would call them today. He'd get a job and still preach in the church. And you know what? The church is where he went grew. And he ended up getting trained. He got trained. There was a preacher who was named W. Stillman Martin, okay? My grandpa talked about him, and I remember this. W. Stillman Martin. And he would travel around the country, and he had a bunch of graduate degrees and stuff like that, but he'd travel around the country on a train, and he'd stop in a town where there was a preacher, and he'd spend a couple of weeks with the guy. And he'd train the dude. He'd spent time with him. He discipled him, okay? He did that with my grandpa. About every 2 years, he'd come by for 2 weeks and spend a couple of weeks with my grandpa. And my grandpa spent the rest of his life preaching the gospel, okay? What am I saying to you? You don't have to go to Bible college or seminary. I sometimes slip up and call it cemetery. I'm just trying to be cute. But if you feel called of God to preach the gospel, start studying, okay? Start studying. I tell you, there's a lot of ways to study the Bible. You could do pretty well with if you get an NIV, New International Study Bible, you could do pretty well studying the Bible and getting messages together. Get a book about how to put together a sermon, how to put together lessons. You can do those things. Get with a preacher. Have someone help you, give you some ideas. But you know what? If you feel like you're supposed to preach, preach and never back off. My grandpa never did. Spent the rest of his life preaching. Remember the folks that scattered from Jerusalem. Not a one of them was trained. They just trusted God and went out and proclaimed the good news about Jesus. We need that spirit today. Hope you will subscribe to my channel, hit the bell, give me thumbs up, make comments.